Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 221 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I'm going to cover a couple topics on the show today. First, I'm going to talk about how much of the rules should you know as a beginning GM. I'll also give a breakdown of where the basic rules of the game can be found and what a new GM should focus on. Finally, I'll give my thoughts on campaigns that make certain classes, subclasses, races, and other player character options more or less desirable, and how you can handle that as a GM to manage your players' expectations and ensure that they make a character that they're going to enjoy playing in your campaign. But before we get to all that good stuff, I have a few announcements for you. The re-release of the past episodes of Game Master's Journey is continuing. So as of recording this, I have re-released episodes all the way back to season 3 of the show. I've gotten back to episode 46. So you can now listen to all the episodes from 46 to this one, 221, for free. It's available to everyone. Now, there's only 100 episodes in the podcast feed. So if you're using some kind of podcast app, you're probably only going to see 100 episodes in your app. But the rest of the episodes are available on the website at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. You can find them there. You can listen to them there, or you can download them from there. I'm just limited to 100 episodes in my RSS feed. So the rest of them you'll have to go to the site for, but they're all there. Back to episode 46. And probably by the time you hear this, I'll have even more of them released. Once I get all of the Game Master's Journey episodes re-released, I am then going to re-release the GM Intrusions episodes. Oh, and really quickly, because I know there are a lot of episodes of the show, I use a URL convention on my website that actually makes it easy for you to navigate directly to any episode you want to go to. And it's simply starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey / the number of the episode. So this episode 221, is at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey /221. So if you want to find episode 46, you go to starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey /46. And it's that easy. We are continuing our actual play of Hinterlands of Elandria, my current D&D campaign. As of recording this, we've played our 12th session. And I believe at this point, I have up through session 10 in the podcast, and I have up through session 10 on my YouTube channel. I will continue to release more actual play podcast episodes and YouTube videos as I have the time to produce them. But I just want to let you know that the campaign is still going. We've completed session 12, and you can look forward to those episodes coming out soon. And finally, I have released my new D&D supplement, Relics of Power. I want to thank everyone who's purchased a copy already. I'm really pleased with how this has been going so far, and I really appreciate everyone who's helped me out by purchasing a copy of this supplement. Relics of Power introduces a new type of magic item into your D&D campaign called relics. And relics can be any kind of permanent magic item, armor, weapons, wands, staves, wondrous items, whatever. And they are items that scale in power level with the level of your player character. So you can give a low level character a magic item as a DM, and that item will grow in power as the player character does. And you don't have to constantly be giving them different items. They can have one item through their entire career and can always look forward to new abilities being unlocked in that item. So in Relics of Power, I give you step-by-step instructions on how you can create your own relics from scratch. And I also show you how you can take an existing magic item, say from the Dungeon Master's Guide, and convert it into a relic. And then finally, I give you a dozen sample relics to get you started. Among those 12 sample relics are the relics from my Hinterlands of Alandria campaign. So for instance, the player character Wall, the Paladin, has the Shield of Alandra. The player character Fear has the Bountiful Growler of Hoppus, and so on. Those items are among the 12 items in Relics of Power. And something that I think is kind of cool that I'm doing about this is the items in the supplement right now are as they are in the campaign. Right now, the player characters are 5th level. So those items have been, you have the properties of those items for levels 1 to 5, but not going on. And what I plan to do is, as the campaign progresses and as these items get more powerful in the campaign, I will update the Relics of Power document with the new abilities of the items. So periodically you will get an email from me saying, hey, there's a new version of Relics of Power out that you can download now, and it will have those items updated. And you get that, well, not for free. I mean, you get that as part of your purchase. So when you buy Relics of Power, whether you get it alone or as part of the bundle, you will get any updates that I make to that. And you should get an email saying, hey, there's a new version. Here's your link to download the new version. So speaking of the bundle, so I have 2 D&D products I've released now, Relics of Power and also an adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. And for a limited time, I have a bundle where you can get both of those together and save a couple bucks as opposed to buying them separately. So thank you again to everyone who's checked out and or purchased either of my D&D supplements. I really, really appreciate it. And it's the number one way you can support this show and support what I'm doing now and in the future. So thank you. All right, so that's the announcements for today. So without further ado, let's move on to our first topic. Friend of the show, Tony, wrote in again, and Tony was talking about being a new GM and how much of the rules do you really need to know before you start running a game as a GM for the first time. And he made a lot of really great points in his email and brought up, I think, some pitfalls in some of the advice that goes around out there, or at least maybe how some people might interpret that advice. And I thought this would be an excellent thing to talk about on the show today. And this is going to be really useful to you new GMs out there, or those of you who haven't GM'd yet but are thinking about it and wondering, you know, what's involved in beginning to GM and what really do I need to know to get started. So Tony says, I've been thinking about the advice I have heard from many sources regarding new GMs. Basically, experienced GMs are saying that new GMs really don't need to worry much about learning the rules of D&D, or whatever game you're playing. They just need to jump in and start playing. Recommendations such as DM should just make a decision during the game and then look things up after the session are typical. Also, I've heard many times that it's better to just jump in as a DM, start running stuff for your groups, and don't feel pressured to read the player's handbook or Dungeon Master's Guide before you begin leading adventures. So first off, I'll say more later, but first off, I got to say, I'm not sure who's giving you this advice, but it's pretty terrible advice. Now, if we're talking about being a player, then I 100% agree. To be a player in an RPG like D&D, you don't need to know the rules. You don't need to read the player's guide. You don't need to know anything. You can just show up to the game ready to play, and your DM and the more experienced players at the table can help you. And as a player, knowledge of the rules is not necessary at all. However, that's as a player. As a GM, it's a totally different story. And I'll talk more about that later. But But just for right now, I will say that the advice that as a GM, you don't need to know the rules or even read the book is terrible advice. So Tony goes on to say, I have found that as a DM, the less I know about the rules, the worse the gaming experience is for me and my players. Although the Dungeon Master's Guide seems to be written for DMs, the information isn't really organized or presented in a cohesive manner to guide new DMs into running the game for players. Actually, there seems to be more rules in the player's handbook that helps the DM to run or to know the mechanics of the game and helps the DM run the game than the Dungeon Master's Guide. And that's absolutely true. And I'll talk more about this later too. But the system of the game, the basics of how to run the game, how to play the game, that is all in the player's handbook. So as a new DM, you want to be looking at the player's handbook as far as learning the mechanics of the game. And indeed, the Dungeon Master's Guide is completely optional. You don't even need to have that book to run the game, although that book is very useful. And I'll talk more later about what specifically you can find in each of the books and where to find them. Because Tony's right, they're not, I don't think they're really laid out with the GM in mind, and especially the player's handbook is more laid out with players in mind. And it is a bit of a misnomer because you would think by the titles that as a DM, as the Dungeon Master, I need to look at the Dungeon Master's Guide, and that's going to tell me everything I need to know about being a DM and how to run the game. But in reality, most of the basic mechanics of the game, and really all of the basic mechanics of the game, are in the player's handbook, not in the DMG. The DMG is additional stuff and optional stuff. And again, you don't even necessarily need it. So back to Tony's email. I frequently get stuck when confronted with rules of the game that I am not familiar with. For example, my players advanced from level 1 to level 2, and it took us 45 minutes to figure out how to actually do that. There are general rules to leveling up for all the characters, of course, but then there are very specific class-related rules for, abilities and spells that you get, etc. I feel like that if I was very familiar with this leveling system, I could have helped my players level up in 5 minutes, but because I was totally unfamiliar with it, we took the rest of the evening to deal with character levels, and I still don't really understand all of it. And yeah, you're absolutely right, Tony. And this is why, one of the many reasons why telling a new GM, oh, you don't need to know the rules is terrible advice, because it's not true. Not if you want your players to have a good time. Now, if you all want to sit down and figure out the rules together and you're not at all concerned about the pacing of your gaming session or actually enjoying the story very much, then, maybe you can all come to the table with no knowledge and figure it out together. But most of the time that is not going to be the case. Most of the time, the players want to actually play the game and have fun playing the game. And in order to facilitate that as a GM, you need at least a basic understanding and grasp of the rules and how your system works. Tony goes on to say, as a DM, my players look to me to tell them how something works. My players fully understand that I'm just as new to the game as they are. However, there is still that expectation that I am supposed to know what I'm doing. Yes, absolutely. That's a very real thing, that expectation. And I think it's a valid expectation. If you're going to run a game, the first thing you should do is read the book of the game that you're running. I don't know who out there is telling people they don't even need to read the book to run the game, but that's horrible advice. It's absolutely false. In many ways, I agree with the players, Tony says. I feel like the more command I have of the rules, the more I can adhere to them, ignore them, or manipulate them in order to run the story for my players. And yes, that comes back to another point that I make over and over again on the show, which is, as a GM, you should learn the rules of your system first. You should know them inside and out, backwards and forwards, before you start thinking about changing rules, introducing new house rules, homebrewing your own systems, things like that. You need to understand your system and how it works intimately. And as Tony says, have command of it before you start monkeying around with it. A perfect analogy would be working on an engine in a car, right? I mean, you learn how the engine works and what all the pieces do before you start taking the thing apart and messing around with it and thinking you're going to modify it, right? Be pretty crazy to think I'm going to get under my hood and soup up the engine of my car when I don't even understand how the engine works and what all the different parts do, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with a role-playing game. If until you know the rules and you've mastered them, you should just be running the game as written and not messing with the rules. Tony goes on to say, also, I was flipping through the DMG and stumbled upon something called inspiration that I'd never seen or heard of before. Now I'm thinking how all the ways I could have used inspiration in the past and how many other rules like that I may not be aware of that are limiting my ability to provide the best play experience as a DM. And yeah, inspiration is a perfect example of why you want to read the book first, because inspiration is a new mechanic. It didn't exist in previous editions of D&D. So even if you're a GM who's experienced running maybe second edition or third edition, if like Tony, if you didn't actually read the player's handbook, then you wouldn't know about inspiration because it's a new thing and you wouldn't be using it and you'd be missing out on a tool in your GM toolbox. Tony says, while I am learning each session I run as a DM, much of it is at the expense of disrupting the game experience for my players. Simply because I don't know, and I either try to look it up or I admit I don't know, and then have to make something up at the time that might not be correct. Personally, I don't like managing games like that. And yeah, I totally agree, Tony. I don't like it that way either. And a big problem with that, and you've probably run into this, is you're running the game, you run into a situation, you don't know how to handle it. You maybe don't even know if it's covered in the rules, or maybe you do, but you don't remember what the rule is. Like Tony says, you have two choices at that point. You can either stop, look up the rule, figure out how it works, which, breaks up your pacing and kills your momentum in the session, or you can keep the game going and just make something up on the fly. However, then you have to deal with the possibility that the thing you made up on the fly is not the way the actual rule works. And if that's the case, then you have to later decide, am I going to keep doing it the way I came up with on the fly during play, or in the future, am I going to do it the way it is in the rules since I now understand that rule? And if I do that, am I going to retcon what happened before or not? And if I don't, I still need to let the players know that, hey, this is going to work differently now. And it's just a big headache that you can avoid by actually knowing the rule in the first place, or at least having some idea of it. So yeah, there's more to this email, but Tony's said quite a bit here. So let's stop and I'll give you my thoughts about this so far. So like I said, there's a difference when you're coming to the table, if you're going to be a player or you're going to be a GM. If you're a player, then the idea that you don't need to know the rules, you can just show up and play, that's a valid idea. And especially for a player who's brand new to the hobby, they're not sure if this is for them or whatever. That's what I encourage of players like that. I'm like, don't worry about the rules. You just come to the game with an idea of a character you want to play. I'll either give you a pre-gen that fits that, or we'll make a character together. And, as far as the rules, I will help you with the rules. You just tell me what you want to do, and I will make it happen. I'll tell you what dice you need to roll or whatever, and I'll handle the rules. Now, when a player is more experienced, then I do expect them to know the rules, at least as it applies to their character. And, this is something we can talk about, is sharing the workload among the GM and the characters. It is the GM's responsibility to know the game that he or she is running. That is the GM's responsibility, to know the mechanics, to know how the mechanics for the player characters work and all that stuff, to be able to run the game. It's the player's responsibility to know how their character works. So, again, for a brand new player, new to the hobby, I don't worry about it. I say, I'll handle the rules. You just play and have fun and decide if this is something you want to do. But for a player that isn't brand new to the hobby and they're like, yeah, I like playing D&D or whatever the game is, then at that point, it becomes your responsibility as a player to know your character. So you need to know, what your character's abilities do, how they work. If we're talking D&D and you're a spellcaster, you need to know what all your spells do. When you say, I cast Magic Missile during play, and I ask you, what does Magic Missile do? You should have the player's handbook open with Magic Missile in front of you so you can answer my questions about it. Because as a GM, I don't want to look up your spells during play. Again, this is an experienced player, not a brand new player. Brand new player, I'm happy to look everything up. But a more experienced player, if you're casting a spell, you should have that information in front of you. So when I ask you, is there a saving throw? When I ask you, what's the save DC? When I ask you, what happens on a successful or failed save? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the area of effect? And obviously, you're not expected to have all that memorized. You just have the spell in front of you when you cast it. So that's the player's responsibility with a more experienced player. And it's totally fine for the GM to say, I'm not going to sit here and memorize what everybody's spells do. I'm going to rely on you to know what your abilities do so that when you use it during play and I ask you, oh, what's that do? You can tell me. And as a GM, I'm going to focus on the overall mechanics of the game and not worry so much about the individual mechanics that apply to specific character classes. So again, as a player, brand new player, great advice to say, hey, don't worry about the rules. Your DM will handle that. Just show up, play, have a good time, decide if this hobby is for you. Now, once you're a player who's played a bit and you're learning the game, then you should take more and more responsibility on yourself to know and understand the rules that apply to your specific character. So that means knowing how your class abilities work. If you have feats, knowing how those work. If you have spells, knowing how those work, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need to know all the rules of the game. If you're playing a paladin, you don't need to know thing one about how wizards work. You just need to know what you need to know to play your character and help your GM out. So all that said, for players, for game masters, for dungeon masters, the idea that you can show up and run a game without having read the book and without knowing the rules is a terrible idea. If people are giving that advice, that's terrible advice. Now, my guess, because I don't know that I've ever heard someone say that, my guess is the advice that people are actually giving is if you're thinking of becoming a GM and one of the things holding you back is feeling like you don't know the rules well enough, don't let that hold you back. You don't have to know every rule. You don't have to have the rule books memorized to run the game. But you do need to know the rules, and that advice, I think, is often assuming that you already play the game, right? So you've played D&D before, maybe for a long time, and you're just now thinking of becoming the GM or the DM, and you're thinking, well, I don't know if I know the rules well enough to become a DM. If you've been playing D&D for a year or months or whatever, you probably have a fairly good grasp of the general rules of the system. And, you should not let not knowing all the rules hold you back. However, when you make that decision to become the GM, you should then be learning the rules, right? So I'm hoping that that's the advice that's being given out, and maybe it's being misunderstood or maybe it's not being stated very well. But that would be my take on it, would be if you're a DM, like let's say you've been playing D&D and you've played a character to whatever level and you know the basics of the system and you're thinking, I'd kind of like to be the DM, but I don't know if I know the rules well enough. It's like, well, you've been playing the game, you know the rules well enough to become a DM. Don't let that stop you. Don't let that hold you back. Definitely take your hand at DMing, but also definitely learn the rules better. And, we'll talk in a little bit when I start talking about where to find various rules, what rules you should focus on. But again, as the GM, you want to focus on the general rules of the game, the mechanics of, how do I call for checks? What kind of checks do I call for what? When do I use an ability check versus when do I use a saving throw? Things like that. Those are the rules you want to focus on as a GM. Don't worry about character specific rules like knowing what every spell does or knowing what a 6th level paladin can do or what a 5th level monk can do. Don't worry about that. Again, you can delegate some of that to the players by saying, hey, as a player, you need to know what your character does so that you can educate me at the table about how your stuff works that your character can do. But as a GM, you want to focus on the rules that you need to know to run the game, just the general rules. And then also when you're preparing for a given session, you want to focus on any unusual rules or rules that don't come up very often that might come up in that section. So for instance, maybe you're planning on having a combat that's going to take place on a ship that's at sea. Well, you might want to brush up on the rules of swimming and drowning and holding your breath and stuff like that, because there's a chance players could go into the water and those rules will become necessary, which is not to say you need to memorize them, but if you've at least looked them over and have some idea of how they work, or at the very least, you know where in the books to find them, it will save you a lot of time at the table when or if that comes up. Or for instance, if you know that the player characters are going to be exploring a dungeon and the dungeon is unlit and they don't all have dark vision, then you might want to look into the rules of light and vision and how all that stuff works. So again, as a GM, you definitely do need to know the rules. You don't need to know all the rules to get started. But you should, as a GM, you should be learning the rules until you have them mastered, until you know them all by heart. You should be, part of your prep as a GM should be learning the rules, because as Tony says here, the better you know the rules, the more smooth your game sessions are going to be, the less time you're going to waste at the table looking things up or trying to remember how things happen or coming up with rules on the spot because you don't want to look it up. And it will just run a lot more smoothly for you. You'll have more fun. And you'll be able to be more consistent, because the problem with the advice of, oh, if you hit a rule you don't know, just make something up, is you either have to, if you do that, you either have to always do it that way from now on. And it's probably not the best way, because you're not a game designer and you didn't play test this idea you just came up with. And, you didn't spend much time thinking of it, unlike the rule that's actually in the book. So chances are really good your rule isn't going to work as well as the rule in the book. It might have some problems. So you either have to be okay with that and be like, well, we're always going to do it this way. That's different in the book because that's what I came up with on the fly. And then you have to remember that forever. And your players have to remember that forever, that we're not doing it the way that's in the book. Or you have to later change it or retcon it. And it's just a big hassle. It's so much easier if you can just know the rule and not be making stuff up all the time. I mean, if you're going to make everything up, why play a game anyway? Why even buy Dungeons and Dragons or any other game? Just make everything up as you go, right? I mean, obviously that's not what we do. And Tony's right. Most players will come to the table with the expectation that the DM knows the rules, and they will expect that. And especially new players, they should be able to rely on the DM to know the rules, especially if all your players are new players, then it's even more important that the DM know the rules. I mean, someone's got to know the rules, right? And that someone is the DM, at least when it comes to the general rules of the game. And then when it comes to specific rules regarding characters, then that's whoever is playing that character. Although it's good for the DM to know them too. I mean, I'm not saying as a DM you get a pass on learning the spells and the character abilities and stuff like that. I'm just saying that you learn the general rules first. But part of being a GM is always getting more proficient with the rules. Anything less than that is lazy and is not giving your players the best experience that you can give them, which is what we're trying to do here. That's why we listen to this podcast, right? We're not GMs that just phone it in and whatever, that's good enough. If we were, we wouldn't listen to this podcast, right? I mean, we listen to this podcast, and I make this podcast because we want to improve as GMs. And one of the best ways that you can improve as a GM is to, if you don't know the rules of your game inside and out, learn them inside and out. So Tony said something here, which I think actually sums it up pretty good. He says, I think I understand that the recommendations to just, quote, jump in and start DMing makes sense in comparison to DMs not running anything until they understand 1,000 pages of rules text. Yeah, exactly. However, I also think the DM has to reach a minimum threshold of understanding of the rules in order to actually conduct game sessions for the players. Yes, exactly. Exactly. You got to know the rules, right? Someone at the table has to know the rules, and the GM should be the one that knows the rules if no one else does. So Tony goes on to say, although Wizards has produce a Dungeon Master's Guide, as a new DM, I feel like there needs to be a resource that will take a DM from knowing little to nothing about the game to a place of actually being able to competently manage the rules of the game to create a quality play experience. The Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide are not organized in a fashion that ramps up new DMs to the place where they can actually run a game. And Tony suggests a Kickstarter for something to help new DMs learn how to run games. So I'm not sure if Tony's suggesting that I do a Kickstarter like that or just that someone does. But if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know, because I'd happily write a book about, how to GM for a brand new GM, with, I guess compiling over 200 episodes, 221 episodes now of Game Master's Journey, distilled down into a single source. That'd probably be useful to people. So if you'd be interested in that, let me know, and I'll give it more thought. So yeah, so the first chunk of Tony's email that we already discussed was this idea of DMs don't need to know the rules. I think we've pretty thoroughly debunked that. And again, I suspect that whoever's giving this advice, what they really mean is don't let lack of mastery of all the rules hold you back from being a DM. If you're someone who's played the game that you want to run before, you probably have a grasp of the basic rules enough to get started. And part of preparing for this adventure or campaign that you're going to run, obviously, I would hope it's obvious, will include learning the rules that you don't know, making sure you understand the rules that you do know, and shoring up your rules knowledge. However, if you're someone who has never played an RPG, or maybe just never played the RPG you want to run before, and you're thinking about DMing, the advice that you can just jump in and start DMing, it doesn't apply to that situation. That's applying to someone that already knows the game, at least somewhat. If you don't know the game at all, then yeah, your first step is to crack open that book for your game, the Player's Handbook or the core book for your game, and read the thing. Now, you don't necessarily need to read the thing cover to cover. Hopefully the book is laid out in such a way that you can figure out what parts you really need to read. So as an example of that, and to give some D&D specific advice and pointers here for Tony and others out there, let's now talk about the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition specifically, and what you need to know to run this game. So first off, before we get to what you need to know to run the game, since I already talked about this a little bit, let's talk about what you need to know to play the game. So let's say you're a brand new player, going to play D&D for the first time, and you want to be a good player, and you want to, and you're willing, you know you're going to like this, you're willing to do a little homework. I don't want it to sound like if you're someone who's trying the hobby for the first time and you just show up and play that you're not a good player. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a difference between someone like my wife, for instance. The first time she played D&D, she was like, I don't really know if this is going to be for me, but I'll give it a shot. That's the kind of person that I'd say, just show up to the game. Don't worry about making a character. I'll give you a pre-gen, or I'll make one for you. Don't worry about the rules. Just show up, play the game, tell me what you want your character to do, and I will handle the rules. I just want you to experience the game, hopefully have a good time, hopefully decide this is something you want to do again. So that's one type of player. A very different type of player, and this was the type of player I was when I started, is someone who learns about D&D and says, this game looks awesome. I want to play this game. I think game is going to be my favorite thing ever. That was me. I remember I was a I was a freshman in high school, and I was in my geometry class, and a kid in my geometry class had the 2nd edition Player's Handbook, and he was flipping through it before class. I asked him as many questions as I could ask him before the class started about what this was, what was going on. He told me the basics of the game. I flipped through his book during the class, and by the end of that class, I was sold on D&D. I wanted to play D&D more than I wanted to do anything else. And so that kind of player, if you're that kind of player and you're like, I want to play D&D, I know I'm going to like it, I am willing to read the book, what should I focus on? So let me answer that for you. So again, if you're wanting to try out D&D or another RPG and you just want to try it out, don't feel like you have to learn the rules. But if you're wanting to start playing a game like D&D and you want to learn to know the rules, or at least you want to learn to know the rules that you need as a player, here's where you go. So Player's Handbook, Tony said something about he doesn't like the way the books are laid out. And I do agree that from the GM perspective, the books aren't laid out necessarily the way you would lay them out. I think the DMG is, but the Player's Handbook isn't. But I would say that's because the Player's Handbook is laid out for players. And as I talk right now about, as a new player, what you should focus on, I think you'll see really quickly how this book is laid out for a new player. So you open the Player's Handbook and you've got your tables of content, introduction. You can go ahead and read the introduction. Chances are, if you're a player that knows enough about the game that you're excited about playing, you probably know most of the stuff in the introduction, but I would definitely not skip it. I would definitely skim it and read anything that you don't already know, because there's some good information in there, but it gives you some of the basics of what D&D is and how it's played. So that's good to read. Part 1, creating a character. Chapter 1, step-by-step characters. You would read this chapter as a new player. This is going to explain the character creation process to you and how you build a character. So it also goes into some of your stats and how they work, leveling up, things like that. So you pretty much want to read the introduction. You want to read chapter 1. And then chapter 2 is races. So the introduction, I'd say read it. Chapter 1, I'd say read it entirely. Races, you don't need to read it entirely. As a new player, you just flip through the races, and they're, in this kind of weird order, which is common races alphabetized first, and then less common races alphabetized after that. And I would say just flip through the races. And if you see one you like, or you think you might like Dragonborn, wonder what Dragonborn are about. Start reading about the Dragonborn until you've read enough to know if you want to play a Dragonborn or not. So just flip through the races, read what appeals to you, and then pick a race. Now, once you've picked a race, then I would read the entire description of that race. When you pick a sub race, I would read the entire description of that sub race. But that's it. You don't need to read all of chapter 2. Just read about the race that you pick. Chapter 3, classes, exact same thing. You don't need to read all of chapter 3. If you're going to play a barbarian, you don't need to know how bards work or clerics or anything else. So flip through the classes, read what you need to read to decide which class you want to play, and then read that entire class. And if you're someone who picks your subclass right away, like a cleric, then you'll want to decide which subclass you want and then read all about that subclass. All right, so our next chapter is, as I flip through the book here, chapter 4, personality and background. So as a new player, this is something you want to look at. This is going to give you guidance on naming your character, height and weight, languages that you speak, alignment, tells you about inspiration and how that works. And then it has the backgrounds. So backgrounds is the same as race or class. Read enough of each to pick the one that you want, and then read more about the one that you pick. And yeah, that's all of that chapter. And then chapter 5 is equipment. And this is kind of a cherry pick chapter 2. Just read about the equipment you need to know about. Chapter 6, customization options. Multi-classing, you don't need to worry about if you're making a first level character, because you can't multi-class at first level anyway. Feats, your DM, also multi-classing and feats are optional roles. So find out if your DM uses multi-classing and feats. But if your DM uses multi-classing, you don't need to worry about it first level. If your DM uses feats, you don't need to worry about feats at first level unless you're playing a variant human. They're the only character that can start the game with a feat. So if you're playing a variant human, then you can look at the feats and pick a feat. And then that's it as a player. That's really all you need to know. The only other thing is if you are a spellcaster and if you have spells at first level, then you're going to want to go to chapter 11, spells, find your spell lists, and spell descriptions and about the spells that you want to pick. You also might want to look at chapter 10 spell casting, but really that's more for the DM. As a beginning player, you don't so much need to worry about that. So again, let me quickly summarize. As a new player who wants to learn about their character and come to the game with an understanding of the rules, I would read all of the introduction of the player's handbook. I would read chapter 1, step-by-step characters. Then chapter 2, races. I would just read about the race that you're going to play. Chapter 3, classes. Just read about the class you're going to play. Chapter 4, personality and background. Yeah, that's a chapter you're going to read to flesh out your character. When it comes to the backgrounds, it's kind of like race and class. You really just need to read the background that you're going to pick in its entirety. Chapter 5, equipment. You can just look up the equipment that you need to know about. It's not really a chapter you need to read in its entirety. Chapter 6, customization options, has multiclassing and feats rules. That's only relevant if your DM uses multiclassing and feats. He may not, or she may not. If you use multiclassing, you don't need to worry about it at first level because you can't multiclass at first level anyway. And if you use feats, you don't need to worry about that at first level unless you're playing the variant human, because they're the only character that gets a feat at first level. And if you're a brand new player, never played before, and this advice is applying to you, you should be starting at first level. Hopefully your DM realizes that, because it will make things easier for you to learn the game. So you see that for a player, the book is very much laid out where you start at literally page 1 of the book and just go page by page through the book, and everything's in order of kind of when you need it and when you need to learn it. So you start out with an introduction. Part 1 gives character creation, how that works, or chapter 1, I should say. Chapter 2 tells you about the races. Chapter 3 tells you about the classes. Chapter 4 helps you flesh out your character with alignment, background, personality stuff, height, weight, stuff like that. Chapter 5 is your equipment. And then chapter 6 has multiclassing and feats if you use that. And then, yes, we can't forget, way back at the back, chapter 11 has your spells. If you're a spellcaster that starts with spells at first level, you'll go there to see your spell list and to read the different spell descriptions. So as a brand new player, that's really all you got to worry about. And with the exception of the spells, it's all the first chapters in the book. Now, this is, I would say, is laid out well for a DM too. It's just as a DM, you're going to be more focused on the chapters we haven't talked about, which come later. So we've talked about, brand new player. Here's what you want to look at to get better proficiency in the game. Now, as a new DM, going to run D&D. Here's where the rules are and what you want to focus on. So first of all, you want to focus first on the player's handbook. You want to master the material in the player's handbook first. The stuff in the DMG is different options you can use but don't need to. More advanced things like creating your own monsters, creating your own spells like that, has a lot of advice on and guidance on things like creating NPCs, creating adventures and campaigns, world building, stuff like that. So there's a host of stuff in the DMG to help you. But as far as learning the basics of the game and how the game works and the mechanics, that's all in the player's handbook. The only rules in the DMG are optional rules that you may or may not use. So you want to master the player's handbook first before you go into the DMG. Again, it's this thing of learning the system before we start fiddling with it. The DMG is going to give you things that you can use to fiddle with the system and adapt it and modify it and customize it to what you want. The player's handbook just gives you the basic system, with the exception of multiclassing and feats, which are 2 optional systems in the player's handbook. But for the most part, stuff in the player's handbook is the core stuff and not so much optional stuff. So as a DM, the first place you want to go in the player's handbook is chapter 7. So again, you'll notice that we are picking up right where the players left off. So with the exception of chapter 11, which is the spells, players left off with chapter 6, which is your customization options, your feats and multiclassing. So as a DM, we're going to start at chapter 7. This is part 2, running the game. So as a DM, the rules of the game are, first of all, in the player's handbook, not the DMG, and they are in part 2 and part 3 of the player's handbook. Part 2 is playing the game. Part 3 is the rules of Magic. So the first chapter as a new DM that you want to look at is chapter 7, using ability scores. So this explains the basic systems of the game. It explains how advantage and disadvantage work, your ability scores or bonuses, proficiency bonus. It explains how ability checks work, difference between active checks and passive checks. Talks about how the skills work, using different skills with different abilities. And then it goes through each of the 6 abilities: strength, dexterity, constitution, etc., and gives you examples of different checks that you would make with that ability score. So for instance, under strength, we have the rules on how much you can carry, how much you can lift, how much you can drag, encumbrance, things like that. Under dexterity, we've got different types of dexterity checks you can do, which includes rules on acrobatics, sleight of hand, stealth, and things like that. So a lot of the, what role would I use for this kind of questions are going to be answered here in chapter 7, using ability scores. Also talks about saving throws and what the different saving throws are for. Next chapter you want to focus on as a DM is chapter 8, adventuring. This has rules for keeping track of time, rules for movement, overland travel pace, different special types of movement like climbing, swimming, crawling, jumping, things you can do while traveling, dealing with the environment, falling damage, suffocating, vision and light rules, finding food and water, social interaction rules are in here. The resting rules are in here. Downtime rules are in here. So that's all in chapter 8, adventuring. And the next chapter you want to look at is chapter 9, combat. This is all the combat rules, talks about surprise, how that works, initiative, turns, rounds, reactions, movement during combat, flying, creature sizes, different actions you can take in combat, readied actions, things like that, different types of attacks, grappling, cover, damage and healing, death and death saving throws and how all that works, stabilizing a creature, knocking a creature out, temporary hit points, mounted combat, controlling a mount, underwater combat, all that stuff. So all the combat rules are in chapter 9. And then finally, the last chapter you want to look at in the DMG as a new DM is chapter 10, spellcasting. This has all your rules about how magic works, how spellcasting works, rituals, cantrips, casting times, components, durations, targets, areas of effect, all that good stuff. And that's pretty much it. So as a DM, you're like, I'm going to run D&D. I want to learn the mechanics of the game and how that works. It's all in the player's handbook. It's all chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10. Chapter 7 is all about ability scores, skill checks, saving throws, knowing which ability to use for what, anything that you think about that specifically applies to an ability, like carrying capacity applies to strength and stealth applies to dexterity and things like that, will be in that chapter. Chapter 8 is the adventuring chapter. That's got everything from your travel rules, keeping track of time, downtime, all that kind of stuff, foraging and surviving in the wilderness, all that kind of stuff. Chapter 9 is all your combat rules. And then chapter 10 is all your spellcasting rules. So as a new DM, you want to focus on those chapters, study those 4 chapters, learn those rules. And once you've done that, you know all of the general rules of the game. The only other rules are specific rules. So one of the guiding principles of most RPGs, and definitely D&D, is the idea of specific beats general. So we have general rules that dictate how the game works. That's what chapters 7 through 10 are. And then we have lots of specific rules that overwrite those general rules. Those are going to be things like individual spells, character class abilities, feats, stuff like that. Those are all more specific rules that take precedence over the general rules. But you want to start with those general rules and know those backwards and forwards. So once you've mastered chapter 7 to 10, or you at least have a good grasp of it, then I would recommend looking at the player characters in your party and learning about the rules that pertain to them. So read up on the different classes people are playing and the rules there, the things that they can do. Read up on the different races people are playing and the abilities they get from that and how that works. And then go through the spells that your characters have access to and look those spells up and learn how those spells work. But again, you don't need to know all that to run the game. That's more just more advanced stuff because again, you can rely on the players to handle their more character focused stuff for you, and you can just focus on chapters 7 through 10 of the Player's Handbook. So now let's talk about the Dungeon Master's Guide. So again, it's a bit of a misnomer because it totally makes sense as a new player or a new DM wannabe, that I would look at Dungeon Master Guide and think, okay, as a DM, this is what I want to focus on. This has everything I need. But it's not true. In reality, the core rules of the game are actually in the Player's Handbook. And if you think about it, it does make sense because, we want our players to have access to this, to know the basics of how the game works. We don't want a player to have to buy the DMG to, be able to look up how something would work in combat or something like that. So it makes sense that the core rules of the game are in the Player's Handbook, but it is a little misleading just going by the titles of the book. So you don't even need the DMG to run the game. You can totally run an entire campaign if you want without it, just using the Player's Handbook. You'll just have to do some more work yourself because you're not going to have treasure tables and magic items and things like that. So you'd have to come up with all that stuff yourself. So you're definitely going to want the DMG. You're definitely going to find a lot of use from it. But at the very beginning, when you're just learning the mechanics, your time's going to be spent in the Player's Handbook. So there's a lot of stuff in the DMG that's helpful to you. A lot of guidance on, building NPCs, building adventures, building your world, making maps, just lots of stuff. And I would say anybody who's serious about being a DM, you should read this DMG cover to cover. You should read the Player's Handbook cover to cover too, eventually. But if you're new and you're wanting to prioritize and make the most of your time and be efficient, here's where you want to focus as a new DM in the DMG once you've mastered chapters 7 through 10 of the Player's Handbook. You want to start out with chapter 3, creating adventures. And especially in chapter 3, you want to pay attention to the encounter building guidelines. So this is going to walk you through building an encounter and getting an idea of how much of a challenge it's going to be for your player character. So there's a lot of good information for you in chapter 3. Chapter 3 also talks about creating adventures, and there's a lot of useful stuff for new GMs in there, assuming that you're running your own adventure and not just running an adventure that you bought. Another chapter you want to focus on is chapter 6, Between Adventures. And in here, you especially want to check out the downtime activities, which is going to give you ideas of how you can handle downtime, which is time that is passing in the world that you're not adventuring. It's like the time in between adventures, basically, and what your player characters can be doing during that time and different benefits they can get from that. And then finally, you want to look through chapter 7, which is treasure. That's going to tell you how to determine what kind of treasure different NPCs and monsters will have, and also has tables to help you generate treasures, and finally has all your magic items and artifacts and explains what they all do. Finally, if you want to, you can also look at chapter 8, running the game. And this has a lot of optional rules and variant rules. So once you feel like you've got a good grasp of the system, you can turn to chapter 8 to help you customize the game to exactly what you want. And then once you get more advanced, you can explore things like creating your own spells, creating your own abilities for the player characters, creating your own monsters and things like that. And you'll find a lot of guidance for that kind of stuff in Chapter 9, Dungeon Master's Workshop. So I think that Wizards actually does a pretty good job of teaching the game. And I think they do a good job of laying out the books. It's just maybe not obvious how it's laid out and might not be what you assume. So again, as a new player or a new GM, most of what you need is in the player's handbook, and that's where you want to spend your time. For a GM, specifically chapters 7 through 10. For a player, chapters 1 through 6, and then chapter 11. And just focus on that. And then DMs, once you've mastered or at least are proficient with chapter 7 through 10, then you can start looking at chapters 3, 6, and 7 of the DMG. And then as you get more advanced, chapter 8. And then as you get even more advanced, chapter 9. And the other chapters in the DMG that I didn't mention are also going to be useful to you, but they're not so much geared toward the mechanics and running the game. It's more the creative sides of being a GM, like creating NPCs, creating dungeons, creating worlds, and all that kind of stuff. And I think for me, I like the way the DMG is laid out. So if we just look at the layout of the DMG overall, we've got our introduction, and then part 1 is, I wish they said what the parts were called in the table of contents. Part 1 is Master of Worlds. That's got chapter 1, A World of Your Own, which is all about creating your own world. Chapter 2's creating a multiverse, which is all about the different planes and figuring all that out. So part 1's all world building stuff. Part 2, which I believe is called Master of Adventures, has chapter 3, creating adventures, chapter 4, creating non-player characters, and then chapter 5, adventure environments, which is all about mapping, chapter 6, between adventures, which covers downtime, and then chapter 7, treasure. And then part 3 has chapter 8, running the game, which is a bunch of optional and additional rules, rules variants, things like that. Chapter 9, Dungeon Master's Workshop, is about creating your own custom content, like your own classes and races and spells and monsters and things like that. And then your appendices. So I think it's laid out pretty logically, but definitely may not be laid out the way that a new player or especially a new GM might assume. So do I think as a brand new DM that you don't need to worry about knowing the rules of your game, that you don't even need to read the book of your game? Hell no. Terrible advice. You absolutely do want to know the rules of the game. You definitely need to read the book. Like Tony said, the better you know the rules, the smoother the experience for your players, the more you can help the players learn and understand the rules, the less time you're going to spend spinning your wheels at the table, discussing rules or looking rules up or things like that, and the better experience everybody is going to have. However, you don't need to memorize the whole book. You don't need to know all of the rules. You don't need to let lack of mastery of the rules hold you back from being a DM, from starting to DM. But you do want to be learning the rules and achieving that mastery as soon as you can. But at least with D&D, there's really not a lot of material. As a new DM, you can just focus on chapters 7 through 10 of the Player's Handbook. And that's really all you need to get started. And it's not that many pages. It's not that much material. And once you've read it a few times, you'll internalize it. And if you don't remember the rule, you'll remember where to find it. And then there's some additional stuff in the DMG that gets more advanced and takes you further. But really, it's not that much to wrap your brain around. But as a new GM, being a GM is not easy. It's a lot of fun. It's extremely rewarding. I personally much prefer it to playing, and most people who do GM say the same thing, at least the ones I've talked to. But it's not easy. It is more work than playing, and you should understand that. And if you're afraid of work, or you don't want to work, or you don't want to put any effort into it, then you probably aren't going to be a great GM, honestly. And probably be better off just playing. It takes a special kind of person to really embrace being a GM, and it is a lot of work, but it's well worth it. And just spending a little time with the rules for your game and learning the basic rules is going to set you up for success. And that's what we're trying to do on this show. We want to set you up for success. When you sit down to run a game for your first time, I want it to be fun. I want you to have a blast. I want it to be easy. And when that first session is over, I want you to sit back and say, wow, that was a lot of fun. It wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. I can do this. And sitting down to run your first game and you've never even read the book and you don't know the rules, you're not going to have that experience. It's going to be a nightmare and you may never run a game again. So set yourself up for success, know the rules sitting down as well as you can, and go from there. And, it never really ends. You can always know the rules better. I mean, I talk about this system all the time on the show. I do in-depth episodes on the books, and I still learn rules all the time or remember rules I'd forgotten or whatever. So it never really ends. So finally, to wrap this up, I do want to remind you that I have done in-depth episodes on the Player's Handbook and the DMG. And if you head to the show notes for episode 221 at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey, I will have those episodes linked in the show notes. So I'm actually doing a lot of this work for you. You can go back and listen to the episodes, for instance, on chapters 7 through 10 of the Player's Handbook. And I go through all those rules with you. And we're now slowly making our way through the DMG. So if you are a newer DM or you just want to brush up on the system, I highly recommend checking out those episodes. And again, you can find them all linked in the show notes so that they're all easy to find. I got another email that I wanted to discuss on the show today. This email comes from listener GM Jacques, who says, "Hey Lex, I love your work and listen to your YouTube content while I'm working or prepping my adventures." Well, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I've been playing a 5e game set in the city of Waterdeep, but was worried if players decided they wanted to play druids or rangers. Is it worth looking up an urban-based subclass for each of those classes so they don't feel they can't pick them without being out of place? For instance, a druid could be a rat catcher or animal tamer subclass, while the ranger could have a bounty hunter subclass. I feel like I should let my players know that if they do play these classes, they probably will be at a slight disadvantage, as they won't have access to the natural world that these classes were intended to work with. Do you ever make campaigns where a class or race will have a disadvantage, and how do you deal with that? Hope you make more awesome content. So thank you so much for that email, Jacques. And I'm glad you're enjoying the show, and I do fully intend to keep making awesome content. So these are great questions, and I'm really glad you brought this up so we can talk about it. So to kind of go through this, so let's say you're someone like Jacques, you're wanting to run a city-based campaign, and the entire campaign is going to be in the city. They're not going to leave the city. And you find yourself thinking about classes like the Druid and the Ranger and maybe even the Barbarian, thinking, well, Druid and Ranger get a lot of cool abilities that are awesome if you're out traveling in the wilderness, but aren't terribly useful in the city, although a creative player can find ways to make them useful. But I definitely agree with Jacques that if we're running a campaign that's 100% going to be in the city, a player playing a Druid or a Ranger will not have as many obvious applications for their skills, will have to work a little harder and be a little more creative to find relevance in the campaign, which is not to say that it's not possible. But they, kind of like Jacques says, they'd be at a bit of a disadvantage, right? It wouldn't be the ideal character to play in that campaign. So Jacques' first question is basically, should I find or come up with different subclasses for these classes that will work in the city to give those as options? So you definitely could do that, but you do not have to. And me personally, I wouldn't. there are so many options in 5th edition. Most RPGs these days have lots of options. D&D definitely does. So of all the classes in the game, Druid and Ranger are just 2. There are plenty of other classes that they could play in this campaign. So I don't feel like you need to feel like you have to replace these with something. Like whatever your campaign is, if you determine that there are certain classes that just won't be the greatest class to play in that campaign, you don't need to worry about that. Like, oh, I have to replace this with something. The players have plenty of other options other than Druid and Ranger to choose from. However, that said, if you know of a subclass, like maybe from Xanathar's Guide or something like that, that would be useful in this campaign, then, you can definitely make that an option if you want to. But I don't think that you should feel like you have to do that or like you have to homebrew something. The players have plenty of options when it comes to classes, subclasses, races, etc. If your campaign says that there's a couple races or classes or whatever that just won't work, that's fine. If your campaign says there's some classes or races that, you can play them, but they're going to be underutilized, that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. The player can always choose to play something different. However, that said, you do want to make the player aware of that. What would not be cool is for a player character to make a druid, or for a player to make a druid character, not knowing that the entire campaign is going to be in a city, and you don't tell them that, and they show up with their druid character and they never leave the city. That would be a bummer. So you should definitely make the player aware, like, hey, you're welcome to play a druid if you want, but just to let you know, this entire campaign is going to be in the city. So, just be aware. And then the player can say, that's cool. I think I can make my druid work in a city and I'm up to the challenge. Or the player can say, oh, well, maybe this isn't the campaign I want to play my druid in. Maybe I'll play something else. So I would definitely, if you do see certain classes or options that players might pick that won't work well in your campaign or won't work as well as other things, I would definitely let them know. And on the flip side, you may want to let them know if there are certain options that would work especially well. So Jock's final question was, does Lex ever make campaigns where a class or race will have a disadvantage, and how do you deal with that? Yes, absolutely. I would say pretty much every campaign I've ever done, there's probably certain races or classes or options that would work better and some that would work not so well. So case in point, my current campaign, Hinterlands of Elandria, I did have this happen, and I made a player's guide. You don't have to do a whole player's guide like I did. You could just do a handout, or you could just have a conversation with the players. But part of what was in that was I told them any classes that I thought wouldn't work very well. I told them any classes I thought would work especially well. I actually had a rating system. I can't remember now what it was. I think I graded them like A, B, C, D, F. So like, oh, this character would be an A class. This would be a really good class for the campaign, or this class would be an F. It would be a really bad class for the campaign. So for this particular campaign, for instance, I told the players that, hey, this would be a great campaign to play a druid or a ranger in, because you're going to be in the wilderness a lot. You're going to be doing a lot of exploring. So it's going to be a great class for druids and rangers. I believe I said that wizard would be a good class because they're going to be part of the guild, and there's, things going on with rifts and magical things going on that would definitely be useful to have a wizard. I did mention that warlock, not so much. I didn't come out and say you can't play a warlock, but I said a warlock probably won't be a super satisfying character to play in this campaign, just because warlocks are much more limited than wizards or even sorcerers when it comes to the kind of magics they can do. And although I think a wizard is the perfect character for this campaign, warlock, not so much. And especially if someone's playing a wizard and someone else is playing a warlock, the person playing the warlock is really going to feel outshined by the wizard. So I really recommend it against the warlock. I think I recommend it against the sorcerer as well for similar reasons, just less so. I think the warlock is worse off than the sorcerer, but the sorcerer is the same kind of thing. It's like if there's a wizard and a sorcerer in the party, the sorcerer is probably going to feel outclassed a lot by the wizard, just because of the nature of the campaign. I think another class I mentioned that might not be the best class was the rogue, which is not to say that you couldn't play a rogue in this campaign and you couldn't have a lot of fun with it, but I wasn't planning to do a lot of dungeon crawls in the campaign, and a lot of a rogue's abilities come into play in environments where there are traps and where you can pick locks and things like that. Also, rogues are really great for urban adventures. And I wasn't anticipating a lot of that stuff. So, I kind of said, depends what kind of rogue you want to play and what you want to do with your rogue, but just be aware, we're probably not going to have many dungeon crawls. You're not going to have a lot of opportunities to find traps and disarm traps and pick locks and things like that. So that's how I handle it. And I actually got a lot of my inspiration for how I do this nowadays from Pathfinder's adventure paths that they put out. Because they would, for each adventure path, they would put out a free PDF that was like a player's guide for the adventure path. And they would do that. They would talk about each individual class and even the subclasses and also the races, and talk about, these classes would work really well in this campaign and these classes not so much. And they even went so far as to sometimes even recommend certain spells or certain subclasses that would work really well and things like that. So I handle it in a similar way. I usually try to let the players know if there's any classes I feel like won't work very well, if there's any I feel like would work especially well. Like, if I'm doing a campaign or planning a campaign and there's going to be a lot of undead, then I might let the player characters know that, hey, this would be a great campaign to play a paladin or a cleric in. And I may not tell them that there's going to be a lot of undead. That's the reason why, but I might tell them that. So I don't think you need to feel as obligated to do it as far as things that work really well, unless you really want someone to play that kind of character. But definitely, if there's an option that a player is considering that you think won't be very satisfying in the campaign you're planning, and you're not going to change the campaign to accommodate this option, then I would definitely let the player know that and give them the opportunity to choose something else. And some players will, they'll say, okay, this isn't the campaign for my druid. I'll play something else. But some players like the challenge, and they're like, hey, I don't care if it's a city campaign. I'm still going to play my druid. And I actually have an idea now for a concept of this druid that's trapped in the city and what I could do with that. So you're putting the ball in the player's court, but you're giving them the information they need to make a good decision. And I think as long as you do that, it'll all be good. So thanks again for writing in, Jock, and posing those questions. Those are excellent questions. And I hope my answers were helpful to you. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 221 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, there are a lot of great ways for you to do so. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me at Lex Starwalker, and you can call my voicemail 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. I will also have all that contact information in the show notes if you didn't catch it. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback for the show, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey. There you can also find links to connect with the Game Masters Journey community on our forum, Google+, and Discord, where you can share ideas, questions, and stories with other listener GMs. I want to give a shout out and thank you to listener GM Shepard, who left a 5-star review of the show on iTunes. Shepard says, Game Master's Journey is an excellent source of inspiration and ideas for designing worlds and campaigns in Dungeons & Dragons. Lex Starwalker has a consistently well thought out approach to game mastering and lots of useful information in his deep dives into the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and other D&D manuals. I have listened to several other D&D podcasts, and this is the only one that I keep listening to for its useful content, interesting interviews, such as with an anthropologist with ideas on designing coherent, credible, and enjoyable worlds, and entertaining live play. Keep up the great work, Lex. Thank you so much, Shepard. That's high praise, and I really appreciate it. And you made my day, sir. Thank you very much. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to help support the show and keep it coming, you can find all the ways to do so at starwalkerstudios.com/support, some of which won't even cost you a cent. The best way, of course, that you can support the show and my RPG endeavors is to check out my latest self-published D&D supplement, Relics of Power. If you'd like to show off your support for Game Master's Journey, you could also get a Game Master's Journey t-shirt. However you decide to support the show, I really appreciate it. You can find Relics of Power at starwalkerstudios.com/store, and you can find a link to where you can get your Game Master's Journey t-shirt and other swag in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.